So I was thinking the other day about how there are a lot of names that are used over and over throughout Jane Austen's novels. Mary Bennet, Mary Crawford, Mary Musgrove, George Knightley, George Wickham, and so on and so forth. That's something that often you don't see a lot within the works of a particular author, a lot of characters sharing the same first name. But of course, the pool of names that they had at the time in the early 19th century was quite a bit smaller than the pool of names that modern day parents or authors writing works set in the modern day can choose from. So I thought I would do a little bit of research to find out which are the most common names in the works of Jane Austen and which ones are the rarest. So for this, I used a page from the Jane Austen wiki titled List of Characters by Novel. And I only did the main 6 novels, so Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Persuasion, Emma, Northanger Abbey, and Mansfield Park. Not any of the other things like Sanditon or the Watsons or anything like that. And when I counted how many had the same name, I combined names that are usually alternate spellings or variants of each other. So for instance, there's Eleanor Dashwood and Eleanor Tilney, and they have the same name but it's spelled differently. I counted those together. Or the same thing for common nicknames like Eliza or Lizzie and Elizabeth, Tom and Thomas, and so on and so forth. I excluded any characters that just had a surname or a title and a surname, but not a first name given. So for instance, I can't do anything with Mrs. Norris or Colonel Brandon because their first names just aren't known. And I also excluded any characters that were noted to be real people because I wanted to focus on what Jane Austen named her characters and not what names were common in real life at the time. Ultimately, what I found was that there were a few very common names and a lot of others that only belonged to a couple of characters, or in some cases only one character. I also found that there was a lot more variety in women's names than in men's. The most common name for men in Jane Austen's novels is John, which was used 14 times, followed up by a 3-way tie between William, Charles, and Henry, or Harry, which is traditionally a nickname for Henry. Each of those were used 9 times. Among women, the 2 most popular names were Mary and Anne or Nancy, with 8 characters each having that name, followed up by Elizabeth or Eliza and Frances or Fanny, with 5 characters each. With, again, Nancy, Eliza, and Fanny being at the time mostly used as nicknames for Anne, Elizabeth, and Frances. Now, this is including all of the characters that were listed on the page that I used as a reference, whether they were the protagonist of the novel or just a very insignificant supporting character. But I wanted to look a little bit closer at the more notable characters and how common or uncommon their names were. You might not be surprised to know that Fitzwilliam Darcy is the only character with the first name Fitzwilliam, I think. I'm assuming that Colonel Fitzwilliam from Pride and Prejudice, that Fitzwilliam is his last name, because from what I understand, military titles are usually Colonel last name or, so on and so forth. In any case, aside from Mr. Darcy, Lydia Bennet, Mary Ann Dashwood, and Edmund Bertram are also the only ones in all 6 novels to go by those first names. Others with relatively uncommon first names include Eleanor, which with 2 different spellings is the first name of Eleanor Dashwood and Eleanor Tilney. Emma, which is the name of Emma Woodhouse and her niece Emma Knightley. Frederick, as in Frederick Tilney and Frederick Wentworth. Catherine, shared between Catherine Morland, Kitty Bennet, and Lady Catherine de Bourgh. And Jane, which is the first name of Jane Fairfax, her mother who was born as Jane Bates, and Jane Bennet. Major characters who share their names with a whole lot of others include John Willoughby, who it's good that he's usually addressed as Willoughby rather than John because there are multiple other Johns, even just in Sense and Sensibility, let alone the 14 in all 6 novels. Henry Tilney and Henry Crawford also share their first name with quite a few others, as do Charles Bingley, Anne Elliot, George Wickham, and George Knightley. I think it's very interesting that the names of even some of the protagonists of these works were repeatedly reused throughout many of the novels. And in some cases, the name was even used for multiple characters within the same novel. It seems a little bit odd because even though in real life it's very common for people to have the same name, Authors often tend to avoid that and try to give each of their characters a different one. However, I guess it also does make sense because the number of available names in Regency England was very different from, say, in the modern day United States. And in the modern day, a lot of parents want their children's name to be relatively unique, whereas at the time when these books were written, that wasn't really a consideration. I have not looked at like historical records that could verify this or anything, but I wouldn't be surprised if the popularity of the name John in Jane Austen's work just had to do with how popular it was in society at the time, because that has traditionally been a very common name in English-speaking countries. I do think it's fascinating too that such a wider variety of names were used for female characters than for male ones. And there were no women's names that were used anywhere near as frequently as John was for men. I'm not sure what the factors might have been, whether it had to do with more names being used for women in just the society of the time, or the fact that the author herself was a woman, or what, but I do think it's very interesting. Anyway, I hope you found this as interesting as I did, because I thought it was fascinating to look into the different names that were used and how common they were.